The morning, I found the letter inside my husband's winter coat. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me later when I thought back on it. After 36 years of marriage, maybe your body already knows the truth before your mind catches up. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone. I folded that letter exactly the way I'd found it, tucked it back into the inside pocket of the coat, and hung the coat right back on the hook by the garage door, where my husband, Howard Aldridge, always kept it. Then I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, because before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever discovered that the life you were living wasn't entirely real? That the person sleeping beside you had carefully arranged things in a way you were never supposed to see? If that's ever happened to you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Stories like ours deserve to be spoken out loud. And if you're watching tonight, let me know where you're from and what time it is there. If someone in our neighborhood had described Howard Aldridge to you, they would have used the word steady before anything else. Steady Howard. Reliable Howard. He coached youth basketball at the rec center for 12 years. He brought casseroles to sick neighbors without being asked. At our church in Greensboro, North Carolina, people looked at him the way you look at something solid, a cornerstone, something you build around without questioning whether it belongs there. We met when I was 24 years old. Working as a receptionist at an insurance firm, Howard was an accounts manager there, 3 years older, serious in a way that felt safe to a young woman who had grown up in a house full of chaos. My father drank. My mother worked double shifts and came home too tired to fight him. Safety was the thing I wanted most in the world, and Howard offered it with both hands. What I didn't understand at 24 was that safety and control can wear the same face for a very long time, before you learn to tell them apart. We married in the spring. I kept working for the first few years, and I was good at my job. I liked the rhythm of an office, liked being useful in a way people noticed. But when our daughter Simone was born, Howard sat me down one evening with the calm, organized manner he always brought to difficult conversations. "You can keep working if you want," he said, "but I've run the numbers. Between childcare and gas and lunches and dry cleaning, you're barely breaking even. It makes more financial sense for you to be home." I remember thinking it over seriously, turning it like a coin in my hand. And I thought, he's right. He knows numbers. He's always known numbers. So I gave notice the following month, and I told myself it was a practical decision, and I believed that for a very long time. Howard handled everything after that. Every account, every bill, every investment. When I asked about money, he answered with enough confidence that I usually stopped asking. "We're fine, Iris, but we can't be careless." That sentence became a kind of refrain in our house. Can't be careless. So I wasn't. I clipped coupons. I drove a car with 200,000 miles on it longer than I should have. I repainted the kitchen myself instead of hiring someone, because Howard said paint and labor together weren't a smart use of money right now. Meanwhile, Howard bought himself a boat when Simone started middle school. A used one, he was quick to say. A good deal he couldn't pass up. I accepted that because Howard always had an explanation, and his explanations always arrived wrapped in logic. So neat, you felt foolish unraveling them. The strange thing, looking back, is that Howard was never cruel in any way people would recognize. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He was patient and measured, and he called me sweetheart, and he brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. That's what makes it so hard to explain even now. The control didn't look like control. It looked like competence. It looked like love. The first real crack appeared 3 years ago, the night I found Howard at the kitchen table, at 2 a.m. with his reading glasses on, squinting at paperwork he closed too quickly when I walked in. "Just some investment stuff," he said, sliding the folder aside. "Investment stuff at 2 a.m? He smiled. "You know how I am. You get a number stuck in your head. You can't sleep until it makes sense." I believed him. But I noticed, after that the den door was locked more often. That he shredded papers immediately instead of letting them stack up on the desk. That when the mail arrived, he always got to it before I did. I told myself I was reading too much into nothing. Then our daughter Simone's marriage fell apart. Simone called me on a Tuesday afternoon, voice flat and strange. She told me her husband, Darnell, had emptied their savings account and moved out while she was at work. She'd come home to a half-empty house and a note on the kitchen counter. She had 2 daughters. My granddaughters, Chloe and Autumn, who were 7 and 9 years old at the time and needed to understand why Daddy's things were gone. I wanted to drive to her apartment immediately. I wanted to bring groceries and sit with her and hold my grandchildren while Simone cried. I wanted to do every small, practical thing a mother does when her child's world falls apart. But I also had to talk to Howard. That evening, while Simone was putting the girls to bed over the phone with me on speaker, so I could read them a story. I watched Howard come home and set his briefcase down and pour himself a glass of water, calm as ever. I told him about Simone once the girls were asleep. He listened with his hands folded on the table. She needs some help, I said. Just until she gets back on her feet. An attorney retainer, maybe a few months of rent backup. Howard was quiet for a moment. How much? Maybe $8,000. He exhaled slowly. Iris. Howard, she's our daughter. I know that, he said. And I love Simone. But $8,000 isn't a small amount. We can't just hand out money without thinking. Hand out. Those 2 words landed hard. She's not asking for a gift card, I said. She's asking us not to watch her drown. Howard rubbed the back of his neck. I hear you. But sometimes people need to go through the hard part themselves. It builds. It teaches you things that cushion doesn't. Cushion. He called our help cushion. I looked at my husband across the kitchen table and felt something I hadn't felt before. In 36 years. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Something that asked a question I didn't want to hear. If he won't help Simone, what exactly is he protecting? I didn't sleep well that night. I kept returning to that question while Howard breathed steadily beside me, perfectly at peace with himself. The next morning I went to the grocery store. On the way back, I stopped at the ATM to pull out some cash for Simone. Money from the small personal account I'd kept quietly for years, birthday money from my sister, small transfers I'd made without mentioning them. It wasn't much. $3,500, everything I'd managed to squirrel away. But it was mine, and I was giving it to my daughter without asking anyone's permission. What happened next didn't happen all at once. It happened the way water finds a crack, slowly, patiently, working its way through. A few weeks after Simone's situation, I was helping Howard sort through the coat closet because we were donating some things to the church clothing drive. Howard was at work. I went through jackets methodically, checking pockets the way you do before you give things away. His gray wool overcoat, the one he wore every winter to the firm's holiday party, had something in the inside breast pocket. I assumed a receipt, maybe a parking ticket. It was a letter, folded twice, handwritten on plain white paper. I won't tell you exactly what it said, because some things are too private to share even now. But I'll tell you this. It was from a woman named Verity Hollins. It was warm and familiar in a way that suggested history, and it mentioned something that stopped my breathing entirely. A phrase about the arrangement continuing as planned, and her gratitude for his consistency all these years. Consistency. All these years. I stood in that closet for a long time, holding that letter. Then I did what I described at the beginning. I folded it exactly as I'd found it. I put it back. I hung the coat on the hook and I went to make tea. Because I had learned something, in 36 years of marriage, about the importance of not showing your hand before you understand what you're holding. I knew the name Verity Hollins. Not well, not personally, but I knew it. Howard had mentioned her perhaps twice over the years, once in connection with a volunteer committee at the rec center, once in CSAC when he mentioned a colleague's retirement party. Both times the mention was brief, almost engineered in its casualness. The way you mention someone you want to seem unimportant. I started paying attention in ways I never had before. Howard's phone faced down on the counter now when it used to sit screen up. He took calls in the garage. He spent more time in his den with the door closed. And one evening, when I walked in unexpectedly while he was at his desk, I saw him close a browser window so fast, his elbow knocked his coffee mug sideways. Just looking at investment dashboards, he said, writing the mug. Boring stuff. I nodded. I smiled. I brought him a fresh napkin for the spill. But inside, something had started moving that I couldn't stop. I didn't know what Verity Hollins looked like. I found her eventually. Not on social media. She didn't seem to have much of a presence there, but through a local Greensboro business directory. She ran a small bookkeeping service out of her home. She was 61 years old, which meant she and Howard were close in age. Her photo on the business page showed a neat, quiet-looking woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a small, careful smile. She didn't look like a villain. She looked like someone's aunt. I stared at her photo for a long time, trying to decide what I felt. Rage was what I expected. What I actually felt was closer to vertigo. Because something about Verity Hollins's bookkeeping business was nagging at me in a way I couldn't explain yet. 3 weeks after I found the letter, Howard left for a weekend fishing trip with 2 men from his church group. He'd been doing this trip every September for years. I'd never had any reason to question it. This September, the morning after he left, I went into his den. I want to be honest about what that felt like. I stood outside the door for nearly 10 minutes. I was raised to respect privacy. I'd respected Howard's privacy for 36 years. His papers, his filing cabinets, his separate mental world of numbers and plans. Some part of me still felt that opening that door was a kind of betrayal. But then I remembered Simone's voice on the phone. That flat, stunned quiet, and I thought about the word cushion, and I opened the door. His filing cabinets were organized the way Howard organized everything. Alphabetically, precisely, labeled in his small, neat handwriting. I went through them carefully, putting everything back exactly as I found it. Tax records, insurance documents, retirement account statements. Then I found a section labeled Consulting. MISC. Inside were several folders that didn't match anything I recognized from our shared financial life. Account statements for something called Aldridge Advisory LLC. Correspondence with a bank I'd never heard of. Investment summaries with balances that made my knees want to give out. Numbers I had never seen. Money I didn't know existed. I sat down on the floor of his den because I needed to be closer to the ground. I opened folder after folder. The accounts weren't new. The oldest statements went back 9 years. Some had only Howard's name. But several, listed Verity Hollins alongside him. Joint correspondence address, joint fiduciary authorization. My husband had built a financial structure I knew nothing about. And he had built it with another woman's name attached. I photographed everything with my phone. My hands were steadier than I would have expected, and I think it's because the thing I was most afraid of, not knowing, was already over. What replaced it was clarity. Cold and painful and absolutely clear. At the very back of the last folder, I found something else. A printed email chain. Howard's address at the top. Verity's below. The most recent message was from 4 months ago. I read it twice. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, closed the filing cabinet, and went to sit on the back porch. Outside, our yard was starting to go gold at the edges. The hydrangeas I'd planted along the fence when Simone was 12 were still blooming, somehow, in the September heat. I'd planted those myself. I'd watered them every summer. I'd pruned them back in the fall and watched them come back every spring. I thought, I have kept things alive in this marriage that Howard never even noticed were living. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my sister Noralyn, who is 70 years old, and has buried one husband and left another, and has opinions about everything that I have been grateful for my entire life. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very carefully, "Iris, you need a lawyer before you need anything else." I knew she was right. I found the attorney the same way I found most things in those weeks. Carefully, privately. With the focus of someone who understands that the window for gathering information is limited. Her name was Christine Beaufort, and she specialized in family law, with a particular focus on what her website called financial concealment in long-term marriages. I read her client testimonials 3 times before I called. When I walked into Christine Beaufort's office 2 days later, I was carrying a manila envelope with copies of everything I'd photographed in Howard's den. I sat across from a woman in her early 50s, with a calm, direct manner that reminded me of a doctor delivering a serious diagnosis. Not unkind, but unwilling to cushion what needs to be said clearly. She looked through the documents methodically. When she finished, she looked up. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, "these accounts represent a significant and long-standing pattern of asset concealment within your marriage." I asked her what that meant in practical terms. "It means," she said, that your husband has spent nearly a decade moving marital assets into structures outside your knowledge or consent. The joint authorization with Ms. Hollins complicates the picture, but doesn't change the fundamental issue, which is that you have been excluded from your own financial life. I asked the question I was most afraid of. Is this just money, or is it something else? Christine looked at me steadily. From what's here, I can't tell you definitively what the personal relationship with Ms. Hollins is. But financially, she appears to have served as a vehicle. Whether or not there's more to it, that may matter to you emotionally. But it matters less to this case than the asset trail. Something about that answer unsettled me more than a confirmation of an affair would have, because it meant I didn't actually know what I was dealing with. I drove to Verity Hollins's address 3 days later. I want to say I thought carefully about whether to do it. I didn't. I got in my car and drove, the same way you do when a part of you already knows and just needs to stop pretending it doesn't. Her house was a small craftsman bungalow on a tree-lined street, neat yard, a wind chime on the porch. Nothing about it looked like the home of a woman living off secret money. I knocked. When she opened the door, she looked at me for a moment before she knew who I was, and then she knew immediately, the way people do when guilt has been waiting somewhere close to the surface. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, "you know who I am." "Yes," I asked if I could come in. She stepped back and let me inside. Her living room smelled like old books and something floral. A candle, maybe. The furniture was modest and worn. I sat on her couch, and she sat in a chair across from me, and we looked at each other for a moment like two women who have been asked to share something neither of them chose. "I need to understand what your relationship with my husband is," I said. Verity pressed her lips together. She looked exhausted in the way that people look when they've been carrying something too heavy for too long. "It's not what you think," she said. "I heard that before and didn't believe it," I told her. "So take your time and say something more specific." She was quiet for a moment. Then she started talking. She had met Howard 12 years ago through the rec center. This was true, exactly as he'd mentioned. They had served on the same volunteer committee. They became friendly. When Howard started talking about restructuring his personal investment planning, she offered to help. She was a bookkeeper. She knew her way around accounts and filings. "At what point did it become something more?" I asked. She looked at me sharply. It didn't. I stared at her. Verity exhaled. "Howard and I were friends." "Our friends? That letter you found." "I know you found it. He told me you'd gone through the closet." My stomach dropped. He told me, she continued carefully, that you'd been going through things. He was worried." "Worried," I repeated. "The letter was about the accounts," she said. "About the arrangement. I'd been asking him for months to tell you. About all of it. I told him it wasn't right. Something shifted in the room." "You told him to tell me?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I knew eventually you'd find out anyway," she said. "And because," she stopped, "because what he was doing wasn't fair to you." I didn't understand the full picture when I agreed to help with the paperwork. By the time I did, it was too late for me to just walk away cleanly. My name was on things. I sat very still. "What was he planning to do?" I asked quietly. "With all of it, with the money." Verity looked at her hands. "He talked sometimes about retiring differently than you expected. About having flexibility he didn't have to explain. Flexibility he didn't have to explain." Those words were so precise they hurt. Not an affair. Not a secret second life in the romantic sense. Just Howard, quietly, systematically, building a version of retirement that did not include me as an equal. He wasn't running away to Verity. He was running away from accountability. From me, from 36 years of a marriage he'd turned into a management structure without telling me that was what he'd done. I thanked Verity. I don't know why. It came out automatically. She looked like she might cry, which I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to deal with, so I excused myself and walked back to my car and sat in it for a long time before I trusted myself to drive. Howard came home from his fishing trip on Sunday afternoon, looking rested and cheerful, carrying a cooler with 2 striped base, and asking if I wanted him to grill that evening. I said sure. I set the table. I opened a bottle of wine. I watched my husband move around our kitchen and I thought about 36 years of Sunday evenings just like this one. And I felt something quiet and final settle inside me, like a stone sinking to the bottom of still water. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with Christine Beauford's card and my phone, and I made a decision I had been circling for weeks. I texted Christine first thing the following morning. She called me back within the hour. "When you're ready," she said, "we'll move quickly." I was ready. What happened next took 6 weeks of careful work. Christine filed strategically. I had copies of everything. Verity, as it turned out, was willing to cooperate fully, partly out of guilt, partly because she had her own concerns about what she'd allowed herself to be used for. I won't describe the legal process in detail because the legal process wasn't the point. The point was, what happened the evening Howard opened the envelope. I had asked Christine about the best way to serve the papers, and she'd said gently that the choice was mine. Some clients want it to be clean and distant, a process server, a public place. Others want to be present. I said I wanted to be home. He came in around 6, same as always, set his keys on the counter, shrugged off his jacket, started asking about dinner. I told him there was an envelope on his desk he should look at. He gave me a slightly puzzled look and went to the den. I stood in the kitchen. I heard the desk chair roll back, the sound of paper, silence. Then, Iris. I walked to the doorway. Howard was sitting at his desk, holding the papers and looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 36 years. Not anger, not guilt exactly. Something closer to the look of a man who has confidently calculated the weight a structure can hold, and has just watched it collapse anyway. "What is this?" he said, though he knew. "You know what it is," I said. He set the papers down slowly. "How long have you?" He stopped. His eyes moved to the filing cabinet, to the den, the space he'd kept locked and organized and private. "You went through my things." "I found a letter in your coat," I said, "back in September. I went from there." Howard was quiet for a moment. Then, "You should have come to me." I almost laughed. "Howard, you were moving money for 9 years. It's not." He started and then stopped because there is no good way to finish that sentence when the documentation is already in an attorney's hands. I stood in the doorway and looked at my husband and felt, underneath everything, one single clear thing. I was not afraid of him. I realized I had been, in small ways, for a very long time. Afraid of his disapproval, his logic, his quiet certainty that he always knew better. That fear had kept me small, and it was simply gone. I told him Verity had cooperated. His face did something complicated at that. He rubbed his hand over his mouth. After a long moment, he said, very quietly, "I didn't plan for things to turn out like this." "I know," I said. "You planned for them to turn out differently. That's the problem, Howard. You were planning. I was just living." He didn't have an answer for that. Simone came over the following evening. I hadn't told her everything yet. I'd told her Howard and I were having serious problems and that I was speaking with an attorney, and she'd arrived with a bag of groceries and her daughters in tow because Simone, when someone she loves is hurting, feeds them. We sat at my kitchen table after Chloe and Autumn went to look at the hydrangeas in the backyard, and I told my daughter what her father had done. Simone listened. She didn't interrupt. I finished. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me. "I always knew something was off about how he talked about money," she said. "Like it was his. Not yours. Ours, but really his." I looked at her. "Even when I was little," she said carefully. "The way he'd say things, like when you wanted to buy something you'd ask him. But he never asked you." I hadn't thought about it that way. But she was right. In 36 years I had asked permission and Howard had made decisions. We had called it partnership. It wasn't. Simone reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry, Mom." "Don't be sorry," I told her. "Just keep doing what you're doing. You're already stronger than I was at your age." She squeezed my hand and didn't say anything, and that was enough. The mediation process took several months. I won't pretend it was easy. Howard, once he understood that Verity's cooperation had closed most of his escape routes, became someone I recognized in a new and unflattering way. Precise, controlled, determined to minimize rather than accountable. His attorney argued that the accounts had been structured for legitimate planning purposes. Christine presented 9 years of transfer records and asked the mediator to explain what legitimate planning purpose required a spouse's complete exclusion. Howard never really had an answer. What I remember most from those sessions isn't anything anyone said. It's the moment, about 2 hours into the second session, when Howard looked at me across the conference table with genuine puzzlement. Not anger, puzzlement. And I understood something I hadn't understood before. He was confused, not about the finances, about me. He had genuinely not expected me to fight back. After 36 years of careful financial dependency, of keeping me small and asking permission, and grateful for reasonable, he had calculated that I would be too overwhelmed, too disoriented, too unsure of myself to navigate this clearly. He had underestimated me for so long that he'd forgotten to account for who I actually was. The settlement was finalized on a cold Thursday in February. I signed my name in a conference room that smelled like machine coffee and old carpet, and when it was done, Christine shook my hand and said, "Well done, Iris," quietly and without drama, exactly the way it should be said. I moved into a smaller house in April, about 20 minutes from Simone's apartment, 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a backyard that needed work which suited me fine. Simone and the girls helped me paint the living room on a Saturday in May. Chloe picked a color called warm linen that she said sounded cozy. And Autumn disagreed enthusiastically for about 40 minutes before conceding. We ate pizza on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet, and I laughed so hard at something. Chloe said that I nearly choked on my garlic bread, and Simone looked at me with an expression I will keep for the rest of my life. "You look like yourself," she said. "Like actually yourself." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and ate my pizza. The hydrangeas I transplanted from the old house. 3 plants, root balls wrapped in burlap, moved carefully in the back of Simone's car. I planted them along the south fence of the new backyard in early May, watered them every other day, and by June they were blooming. Pink and soft and completely indifferent to everything that had happened. I look at them sometimes in the evening when I'm sitting on the back steps with a cup of tea, and I think about 36 years of keeping things alive that Howard never noticed. I think I'm still doing it, except now everything I tend is mine. Howard called twice in the months after the divorce. The conversations were brief and went nowhere useful. He still explained things the way he always did. Carefully, logically, as if the problem were my understanding rather than his choices. The second time he called, he said he hoped I didn't feel like he'd never loved me. I thought about it for a moment. "I think you loved me the way you understood love," I told him. "The problem is that your understanding left a lot of me out." He was quiet for a while after that. Then he said goodbye. And I said goodbye, and I haven't heard from him since. My sister Norlin visited in July. She brought her famous lemon cake and an extremely frank series of opinions about everything I'd been through, which is the only way Norlin knows how to show love. We sat on my back steps until it got dark, eating cake and watching fireflies come up from the grass, and at one point she looked at me very seriously and said, "You know what I kept waiting for you to do all those years?" "What?" "Get mad," she said, "for real. Not polite mad, just mad." I thought about it. "I think I was afraid to," I told her. "I think I was afraid if I got mad, he'd find a way to make me feel crazy for it." Norlin snorted. "That's how it works," she said. "They make you afraid of your own feelings and then use your politeness against you." She's not wrong. What I know now, that I didn't know at 62 when this all began, is this. I was not weak. I was trained to perform weakness by someone who benefited from it. Those are different things, and the difference matters enormously. I spent most of my adult life apologizing for wanting things, for needing things, for having opinions about money that I lived inside every day. I shrank myself to fit a shape Howard had decided was appropriate, and I did it so gradually that I forgot I had ever been any other size. I am not that size anymore. I took a watercolor class this past fall at the community center, which I was terrible at in a way that was genuinely delightful. I joined a book club through the library. Real books, not audiobooks, and we argue about them over bad wine, and that's the whole point. I had lunch with Verity Hollins once, about 8 months after everything was settled, because I wanted to. It was strange and uncomfortable, and also, in its own way, clarifying. She is not my friend, but she is a person, and she was used, and I understood something better after that lunch than I had before. I do not miss Howard. I have missed at times the version of him I believed in for 36 years, but I've come to understand that the man I was grieving never entirely existed. He was a performance Howard gave for an audience that suited him. The real Howard built a financial exit while I planted flowers, and raised his daughter, and waited for a retirement we were never going to take together. That man I do not miss. Simone is doing well. She went back to work full-time at the architecture firm, where she'd gone part-time during the marriage, and she's been promoted once already. Darnell's situation is working through the courts. Chloe and Autumn are 9 and 11 now, and they are fierce in the way girls are when someone teaches them that fierce is allowed. I am teaching them that it is allowed. Last spring, Autumn helped me put in a vegetable garden in the backyard alongside the hydrangeas. Tomatoes and zucchini and herbs I have no idea how to cook with yet. We planted them on a Saturday morning in April, and by July the tomatoes were coming in so fast we were handing them off to neighbors with both hands. I look at that garden sometimes and think about all the things I waited for permission to grow. If there is anything I want you to take from this story, it's not revenge, and it's not triumph. It's something quieter than that. Financial control in a marriage is real, and it is harm, even when it comes wrapped in logic and pressed shirts and Sunday morning coffee. You do not have to be screamed at to be diminished. You do not have to have bruises to have been hurt. Sometimes the most damaging thing someone can do is simply convince you, slowly, over decades, that your instincts are wrong, and your needs are too much, and your financial ignorance is your own comfortable fault. Those are lies, and you are allowed to stop believing them at any age. I am 65 years old, and I live in a house with warm linen walls, and a garden that produces more tomatoes than one woman can reasonably eat. And some mornings I sit on my back steps with my coffee, and I feel something I had forgotten was even available to me. I feel like myself. If that sounds like something you need right now, I hope this story found you. And I hope you'll tell me in the comments what brought you here tonight, and where you're watching from, and what part of this stayed with you. Because your story matters too, even if you haven't told it yet.